remember it having a temptation. Oh, we're live.
It doesn't have the temptation, but...
No, I don't remember the devil being in there from Badoon's reconstruction, anyway.
Yeah. My question was about how would Marcion have interpreted that if it was there, or had he read Matthew, how would he have interpreted that? Would he have identified it with the demiurge, or would he have to be a separate character entirely?
It's funny because Badoon spent some time on that in one of the later readings, because it's interesting that for a lot of people who have multiple gods in their cosmology, it's almost as if they don't know what to do with the devil, because the devil, in some cases, the devil and the demiurge are the same characters, but in other cosmologies, the devil and the demiurge are completely different entities, and sometimes they're not even working together. You know, it's... Yeah.
Anyway, we gone live, so we should do an official start. Hi, Doug.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Yeah, this is our second part of Sebastian Moll's thesis on Marcion, who was a 2nd century heretic. This time we're dealing with it's the section 3, actually, called Marcion's Gods. Last week we went over his biographical information. I actually forget what the first section was about.
The first section was a survey of previous scholars who had done monographs on Marcion.
Yeah, and then he went over some of the sources too, disputed sources. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And we just did this one section in the whole section, the 3rd section for this week. So.
It's a doozy.
Yeah. Lots of good stuff in this section.
Yeah,
so,
I read it, but I didn't give myself enough time to actually study it, so I ended up rushing through a lot of it today because I was so busy this week. Now I'm regretting that I did it at the last minute because there's so much I wish I could have studied in more detail.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So I was thinking like we could, if you guys wanted to, you could all give your like general thoughts of the reading as a whole, but not super specific detail, and then we can jump in like we usually do to like the point by point in reading order, if you want.
Cool. I'll jump in and just say that I am pretty damn convinced by Moll's conclusion that Marcion believed that one God was the superior God of Jesus Christ and the other God was an evil God. I think he's really convinced me of that Harnack's law versus grace sort of dynamic when it comes to Marcion's dualism. I don't think it holds up when you look at the earlier sources. And I think Moll does a good job at encapsulating why several scholars have moved away from Harnack's thesis over the years. So yeah, I thought it was good overall.
Same here. I was persuaded by it. I do have issues with some of what he says in this section on Paul, and I think we need more scholarship there to kind of salvage some of what he's argued in that section. But I think in spite of him having the direction of editing backwards, he still makes good points in that section, in spite of that.
I have to admit, oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say the way it started out, I had no real interest in the question of is Marcion considered the demiurge a just god or an evil god? That question really didn't appeal to me at all. I mean, it wasn't enough to create any interest in me. So it was slow going for a while. I mean, my heart wasn't in it until towards the end when all sorts of fascinating things started coming up, and then I'm sorry I didn't start reading it earlier because I got to about page 102, so there's about 7 more pages for me to go, but it started, all sorts of fascinating things started creeping in there that I'd love to talk about.
Doug, go
on. Go ahead, Leon, if you have anything to say in general of this section.
Yeah, I think considering what I said last week about I thought section 1 was pretty well laid out. I thought chapter 2 was not very well argued, as you guys could remember. I thought section 2 was pretty bad. In this case, though, as you guys will be surprised to hear that I thought that I liked this section. I thought he did a really good case. He argued a really good case for his description of Marcion's God as being the anti-God. So that's generally my take on that.
Anyone else? General thoughts?
What was really good, and what this sort of goes into what I was talking about with Dale before, where when I first read this, when I was doing my thesis on Marcion and Gnosticism, going to the footnotes and looking at the primary sources, like he references Tertullian and he references Justin and he references Irenaeus, actually looking at those references. And I actually, for this talk tonight, I pulled up some of the references, so we weren't just, because he doesn't quote them all, so I opened some of the more interesting ones up for us to talk about, and that was a really interesting experience for me, looking at, like, okay, it's all good that you say this, but what does Justin and Irenaeus and Tertullian say? And that was a really fun experience.
Yeah,
it shows you how deep you can go into this.
Thank you for doing that, Daniel. Yeah, I'm going to be excited to hear those later. So you think he's pretty accurate with how he quotes Tertullian and others? I mean, he doesn't take him out of context, in your opinion?
On these issues, I don't think so. Like, there's probably where you and I will agree, Wayne. There's a few nitpicky things that we'll probably disagree on, but his overall thesis that Marcion believes in a good God and an evil God, I think that holds together. He doesn't misrepresent Tertullian at all. I think Tertullian's clear. I think Justin's clear. So I don't think he misrepresents them all. What was interesting and we'll get into this no doubt, Doug, it is interesting how Moll traces the evolution of Marcion's thought, of how people receive, like the reception history, as it were, how it goes from a good versus evil God to a lawful God versus a just God. So watching that, because no one's really done that before, and what's interesting at SBL these days, reception history is getting really interesting. So just somebody studying Marcion's reception, like Lou is doing, that in itself would be an interesting exercise that Moll's done a lot of groundwork for.
Yeah, I would only complain. My only complaint about the chapter is there were a couple of places where he kind of asserts the whole, Marcion edited Luke thing, which Daniel has promised me that he's going to breach this topic in part 4, so I'm looking forward to that, but I don't think he has a warrant to say that in either chapter 2 or chapter 3.
I agree entirely, Leon, and that's exactly what I was saying earlier. I think that particular part of this thesis needs a little bit of salvage work.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Knowing what's coming, I know you guys are going to disagree vehemently with his thesis, and I do as well. Badoon and Tyson have convinced me otherwise, but it is, what I would stress is that he's not without his reasons. Like, he does present a fairly decent case.
Oh, yeah. He's obviously done the work. He's done the work for sure. He's done work.
So yeah, anyway. And just before we get way underway, Moll is happy to join us on the date we suggested. So people who are watching this, if you want to comment and maybe suggest a few questions for us, like I know we're not going to get through all of people's questions and even our own in the hour, but people listening, if you've got a question idea for us to ask Dr. Moll, post it in the comment section below.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting.
In the you mean on the Facebook page of the group?
No, in the YouTube video or however or Google Plus, however they're listening to this.
Okay.
No, he watched us talk about. He watched the video of the first discussion apparently, and he said he was very humbled that people would be wasting a Sunday night talking about his scholarship. So.
Well, yeah, we'll tell him we're wasting 5.
Well, 6
that reminds me of something. I know we need to budget our time in these Hangouts so we don't go too long, more than we can actually stay. But maybe if we start getting questions on YouTube, we might want to start trying to answer 2 or 3 of them from the previous Hangout, the questions that were asked, in the beginning of the next Hangout. It might be a good thing to do for the future, to try to involve more people. As long as we can budget the time and not, make it work well.
Yeah. John or Shauna, do you guys want to say anything about the general feel of Section 3?
I have no general comments.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like
Other than the small caveat that I said that Wayne shares with me, that's my only really real critique. I actually thought he argued it really well.
Yeah. I think we should start going through the chapter now.
Sounds
yeah.
good.
So the first, well, again, Section 3, Marcion's Gods. This section largely dealt with, I guess, Marcion's theology, whether it's a good-evil dualism or a good-just dualism, or like a kind of a tripartite system of good God, just God, evil God, or good God, just God, evil world, or evil matter. And Moll's kind of taking all these views into account, which are in the sources, and he's kind of examining the sources and saying, okay, what seems to be Marcion's view? Because he's careful to distinguish between, or he's careful to say that we need to distinguish between Marcion's views and the later views of his followers, which he's saying they're not necessarily the same thing. So he basically goes through our sources. It seemed like it was in chronological order, going from the earliest to the later, and talking about what we can get from these different authors and sources about exactly what his theology was. So the first one, well, he talks about Harnack mainly, and I guess he's saying Harnack argued for the just God, good God. And basically Moll's whole idea is, well, no, that's not quite right. He's proposing the evil God, good God distinction. So different from Harnack on that point. And the first thing he deals with is Ptolemy's letter to Flora. And he's arguing. Sorry?
Yeah, the first document, he was the same document from the first part that I think John uploaded on PDF in the group section.
Right. Yeah, one of the things Moll is arguing in this source is, I mean, he argued earlier in the thesis that he thinks this is actually referring to Marcionism, which this was one of the disputed sources. But he's saying there's that first part and then the second part that's talking about getting the view of the law as coming from the devil or the adversary. He's saying that is also talking about Marcion. So Moll's saying this is talking about Marcion, and therefore it counts toward an evil God versus as like the other God from the good God. So what were you guys convinced by that? What did you think of that? So his discussion of that source in that part.
Well, I'm convinced that Ptolemy's arguing against a person who did believe in the good God versus evil God distinction. Whether that person is actually Marcion or not is another question. I think based on it's a plausible theory that it is, and I think based on the other evidence that Moll cites that Marcion believed in the evil God, I find it likely. But it is an assumption here, though. I mean, he could be arguing against somebody who's misunderstanding Marcion, even though Marcion, plausibly could have agreed with Ptolemy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why people said they didn't care for that section. It seemed like a very long, drawn-out argument to prove that one point.
Yeah. I do follow Moll on it, though. I do think that's a cumulative argument with this other evidence together. It helps prove his case.
Would
Yeah,
you
I
like
agreed
me
with
to
it.
read the source from the letter?
I did read the letter, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering, did people want me to read the 3 verses that he mostly focuses on?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So this is from the letter. If, as we have explained, the law was not given by the perfect God himself, and certainly not by the devil, it is not proper even to say this, then this lawgiver is someone other than these. But this is the demiurge and the maker of the entire world and everything in it. As he differs from the essence of the other two and stands in between them, he properly is entitled the intermediate. And if so, by his own nature, the perfect God is good, as indeed he is, for our Saviour has declared this from the Father, who made him manifest, that there is only one true God of good. And if a God of the adversary's name is evil, and is marked by wickedness and injustice, then a God who stands in between them is neither good, and certainly evil or unjust, and cannot call himself just, albeit any sort of justice from this God. So it's an interesting little section.
Yeah, whether or not it's referring to Marcion, like, apparently they were contemporaries, and in Rome, if we can trust to the extent we can trust the sources on either of these people, Marcion or Ptolemy. I think that's one of the big things that Moll uses to say that he's probably talking about Marcion, right? That he would have had to have known about Marcionism, and it just seems to fit Marcion's theology, not just based off of this, but Irenaeus and Hippolytus and Tertullian and all these other guys. So it seems, but again, it does seem like it could, like Wayne was saying, it might not necessarily be referring to Marcion. It could be referring to some Gnosticism or something, possibly.
I think for me, like, I think it helps his argument, but it's not like the foundation. Even if you took out the letter, I think Justin and Tertullian and Irenaeus, who we can be sure they are referring to Marcion, I think they bedrock his case much better. The letter is sort of just gravy, but what makes it more interesting is that it has the potential to be contemporary. So.
Yeah, and a lot of it does seem to fit, which is nice. Yeah, it's not conclusive, but like Wayne said, it's cumulative. So
there's a little bit of a question mark as far as I'm concerned. The only little bit of a question mark that I would have is the fact that Marcion, or at least whatever surviving fragments or citations of Marcion, he doesn't ever seem to use the word demiurgos. So that's a little bit.
Demiurge is our word.
I'm sorry?
No, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying Moll and most scholars use demiurge just for explanatory.
I know, but so did the letter, is what I'm saying. The letter you just quoted, so does the letter use the word demiurgus. So there's just it's just a little bit of pause.
Yeah, and that's important too, because one of the things Moll talks about later is that Marcion never used that term, or doesn't appear to have in his... Yeah, so... But it was definitely a term used by Gnostics, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely by the Valentinians, and apparently by Basilides and company.
Yeah. But it's one of Valentinius' favorite words.
It wouldn't be the first time, though, or the only time, that critics of Marcion put his theology into their own language and own terminology. I mean, they're not always careful to use his terms.
That's true, but I think we should. I think we would probably think that it was a later use and not an earlier, if that's the case.
Well, Moll does mention later on that that they tend to lump heretics together.
Right.
So they were kind of lumping in Marcion with Gnosticism. So a lot of the terminology they use could just be because they're doing so. But that calls into question, where there's a long section in the chapter that goes on to what each of these guys were reacting to as Marcionitism developed over time. So that, okay, this is probably something that resulted from their followers saying. But if you take that further enough back, if they're mixing their categories around, how do we know exactly that even the earliest contemporary witnesses were not positing views to Marcion that were actually his?
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of like how they did for Paul, for instance.
Yeah.
Because if they're lumping people in with agnosticism and they're saying Marcion subscribes to something, maybe they're just confusing his beliefs with other Gnostics that they're familiar with.
Well, and as Wayne's pointed out, Marcion's never mentioned by name, so it could like, who even knows really if it is Marcion directly? It could be somebody else who has a similar theology for all we know, or maybe even Marcionism is having its own variants even in its earliest period.
It's the missing link between Marcion and Valentinus.
If I did have one general thought, it would be that after all that discussion, I was still left the impression that what can we really know about Marcionism for sure?
The eternal struggle.
That's a better question than we probably realize. That's a great question.
Since it's so fundamental to this chapter, and it's kind of a subtle point that some listeners may miss or have trouble grasping, can somebody in a succinct way explain the difference between good and evil versus just?
Okay. Do you want to have a crack, Wayne?
All the discussions were German, I think, where it was clearly where it was defined, it seemed.
I wouldn't be good at making that, actually. I actually want to hear a good explanation of that.
Well, I got the good-evil part's pretty straightforward. I mean, there's a good God, like he's, from our perspective, morally good, and then there's an evil God who's out to do bad, evil things.
Mm-hmm.
But then the just part is the more unsure part. Just could mean just as in, I mean, that can carry a lot of connotations. Like, it could also mean kind of good. He's justice. He's concerned about justice and wants to, give people what they deserve or rule out proper justice. But then Moll is also talking about, well, it may have not really had that connotation. It may have been more like.
He points out that on those instances where they're trying to illustrate the justice of God are exactly those instances where God is portrayed as a cruel and heartless kind of punisher God, and because of that, it's fair to kind of equate that with an evil God. And he also makes a really good point when he says that the earlier version of Marcionism was dualistic, whereas it evolved into a triistic form later. And I think he did a really good job of demonstrating that the dualistic form was earlier. And if that's the case, then it seems to indicate that they're all along from the beginning, and that it just was kind of a cleanup job, like a damage control for the image of God as the evil God, if that makes sense.
I guess I want to ask if does just mean just a strict implementation of rules and stuff. I mean, is it almost synonymous with tyrannical? I mean, is it almost synonymous with tyrannical? I mean,
Steve, the dichotomy I would use, is you've got good God versus evil God in one system, and you've got merciful God versus lawful God in the other. So it sort of plays it differently. Rather than like God of love and God of justice, you flip the words a little bit. So you've got a God of mercy and freedom and grace, and a God of rules and regulations and procedures. So it's sort of like what you were talking about before, Wayne, where it's not so much that this God is evil, he's just a stickler for the rules. And that idea, according to the interpretation of Marcion, comes from Paul's letters, where, particularly Galatians, where it's like, no one can keep the law. Like, even though the law is a good thing, no one can keep the damn thing. So that sets up this unfair system. Even though it's from a divinity, that doesn't necessarily mean it's sort of good for humanity. That sort of thing.
Daniel, I had a question about texts like that, like you said, Galatians, or I found, in Romans 7:12, where Paul says that the law is holy and just and good. But I have felt like Marcion, from what we read, Marcion couldn't possibly agree with thoughts like that. It seemed like he felt intrinsically the law was evil at its heart.
That's what Moll argues. That's what Moll argues, that that idea is a later development, and Moll thinks that you're right, that Marcion would have read something like that in disgust. Like no, that's not. That's evil. It's tyrannical. It's punishing, that sort of thing. To put it in a very big nutshell.
In fact, I was wondering, did he think that, would Marcion say that these laws were intrinsically evil, or just that it was evil of the demiurge to give this law to a people that were so... He created man so weak that they couldn't fulfill the law, and so it was evil on his part to give this law, even though it itself wasn't evil, but he was evil to do it.
That's sort of what, like, Irenaeus gets to eventually, that, like, the golden calf sort of plays into Irenaeus's arguments where, God gives the Ten Commandments and, thou shalt not worship other gods, and what happens as soon as Moses goes down the mountain, they're worshipping a golden calf. And it's not that God's disappointed, it's because God knew they couldn't do it, so he sort of delights in the fact that they can't uphold the law, and that in itself is evil. So yeah. But even that is from Irenaeus, who is not, like, even though Irenaeus is a somewhat early resource, we don't, like what John's pointed out, how much do they reflect? So yeah. Anyway, we should probably move on to Justin Martyr.
Well, actually, Irenaeus was the next guy, and he actually says directly that Marcion thought the demiurge was evil, as well as describes him as a judge.
I thought, really? I thought Justin
Martyr is next before Irenaeus.
Oh, really?
Page 73.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hmm.
Or maybe I put a note in for Irenaeus before Justin Martyr. Yeah, okay, I got it mixed up. Sorry about that. Yeah, Justin Martyr.
It's one paragraph because there's only 2 references to Marcion in Irenaeus, but I think it's pretty self-evident there. It doesn't provide. I agree with Moll that even though Justin gives us like our first direct reference to Marcion, it's really not a lot to go on except for that it's dualistic.
Right, that's all he tells us, that he's a dualism.
And is Justin Martyr using the word demiurge again, which we believe Marcion did not use?
He probably was, but again, they may just be using that Gnostic terminology, and they're lumping Marcion in with Gnostics. So that could be all it is.
I think that's a because the translation I'm using doesn't use demiurge in that way.
What's it use? Creator?
Let me take a look.
No, the footnote number 213. I don't know what the Greek word actually means, but it looks like it could be cognate with demiurge in the Greek there. Demiourgu. I can't pronounce that very well. Too many vowels.
Mine is maker of this universe, but But looking at the Greek, it looks like.
Yeah, because.
Yeah, that's the same word, demiurgu. But like you said, the creator, that's all demiurge means is creator, so I don't see how it's an offensive term to anybody. Except that it seems like the New Testament never uses the term. When it uses the word creator, it uses another word, but still, I don't see a problem with, even if Marcion doesn't use the term, if the others use it just in terms of a creator, I think then they're referring to the person that Marcion's referring to.
The other things like we talked about, words pick up meaning in later tradition. Like apostle means emissary, so if someone's an emissary for Christ, it's not like the word apostle doesn't carry the same sort of weight as it does in sort of the later tradition, where it has a lot of theological baggage to it. So demiurge at this point may not have the same baggage it will get when it gets in the hands of the Valentines, or when people ascribe it to Valentinians anyway.
I mean, it had 500 years already. I mean, we're talking about this is...
Well, Plato and stuff.
It's a word that Plato used, so it was a word that was known. Sorry, I
Yeah,
dropped out, so I don't really know exactly where this conversation picked up on.
Yeah, and I'm not really following from Justin Martyr's quote here why this is evidence that Marcion thought the demiurge was evil. I'm not seeing that in this quote.
Well,
it's not.
Moll says that it doesn't give us enough information either way. It basically says he's dualistic, and that's about it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, John.
Yeah.
Doug.
Oh, it's all right. Yeah, the whole demiurge term thing, I just see that as an appropriation probably from, like you said, Platonism, and I don't think it had any specific link, even at that time, to the heresiologists necessarily saying, okay, if we're using that term, we're talking about Gnosticism.
And we don't actually have any extant copies of the antitheses. So it's actually possible that we're wrong about Marcion not using that term. The antitheses may have used that term.
Very true.
Possible.
Does the term demiurge actually refer to a being who would be of lesser, like farther down the chain from
No, it just means craftsman.
God, versus Marcion having a dualistic thing where the evil God and the good God are more or less
No, it
equal?
just means maker or craftsman.
No, but basically, it basically, in Plato's mindset, and this is a very big paraphrase, it's basically that being that crafts who crafts the universe and sets up the rules that govern the universe. That's sort of it in a very loose way. There are other things attached to it in the later Platonic thoughts, but in its simplest term, it's sort of just like the dude who created the world and set up the rules in Platonic thought.
Just as a side note, doesn't that sound very, very much like the Logos?
Mm-hmm.
So Irenaeus.
Yeah, Irenaeus, I have in my notes, he directly says Marcion thought the demiurge was evil, as well as that Marcion thought he was a judge. So I thought that, I put a star next to that source because I thought that was a great case for Moll's argument. This source was like a primary, really good source for him because you've got the judgment thing there, and it doesn't necessarily mean just. Could be like an evil judge, like you were guys talking about, like sending the flood, setting up the law so that there'd be an increase in transgression, and then you could punish transgressions. So judge, again, doesn't necessarily mean just, or justice even.
If you actually go to Against Heresies, the sections that Moll lists, they're very indicative of that in terms of like the one I used that I found interesting that I've now lost, which is awesome. But where are you? There we are.
Yeah, the examples he does use are examples where God seems cruel and putative.
Mm-hmm.
I think footnote 218 is also important to note here, that it is interesting to note that unlike in most Romance and Germanic languages, in classical Greek, the language Marcion thought and wrote in, the terms judge, krites, and just, dikaios, are not related etymologically. So they're completely separate words.
Yeah, I agree, Wayne, and you should get out of my head because I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, this is the section I found interesting. And indeed, the followers of Marcion do blaspheme against the Creator, aligning him with the creator of all evils, but holding to a more tolerable theory that at his origin, and maintaining that there are two gods, gods of different nature, side by side, one being good, but the other evil. Like, right there, that's a direct. And then, what's interesting, in the next session, he says, and those Valentinians, like those from Valentinius, like he distinguishes Marcion and Valentinius very, very directly. So.
And there's one other interesting footnote too about well, Moll just thought it was interesting, and I think it comes up later, but it's relevant to this point here, that even in Isaiah, which Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, it said that, at least in some translations, that God is the creator of evil. And so Marcion obviously would have been probably familiar with that verse. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So yeah, Irenaeus, great source for Moll's conception of Marcion's beliefs here.
Everything that's imperfect about the world is the fault of that evil god. It's an anti-god. I really like the way that he expressed it as an anti-god. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of nails it.
Did you guys want to move to Rhodo or anything else on Irenaeus?
By the way, let me throw this out. I just noticed it. When you guys were pointing out that footnote in page 74, where the Greek word for judge, krites, the Greek word for creator in the New Testament is Christes, exactly the same, all exactly the same letters, except it adds a sigma to it. So the difference between creator and judge is so similar. I wonder if that has anything to do with the confusion that the demiurge is also a judge.
It could be. I mean, we could always excuse that. It's easy to forgive such an etymological blunder, you know.
This is for my own thesis. This was a line I used from Irenaeus that I just wanted to, before we move on. Marcion, of this god, Marcion calls him the author of all evils, lustful for war, inconsistent in his laws, and self-contradictory. So I thought that was a really good one-liner that sums up how Marcion feels about the anti-god.
Yeah.
Is that Tertullian, or is that in Tertullian?
No, that's in Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 25, Verse 3. Boom.
So, so Rhodo, I thought Rhodo was interesting and also important for Moll because he is the earliest source, I think, that at least that Moll lists, where we have someone telling us that Marcion's theology has, or not Marcion personally, but Marcionite theology, I guess you could say, started undergoing some evolution or some change.
Yeah, this is the start of a section of Moll's thesis on the first deformation of Marcion's doctrine.
Right, exactly. Which is important for his another part of his overall thesis is that Marcion's theology changed via his followers as the decades went by, you know. So, and Moll's trying to get back to what did Marcion believe, rather than tracing exactly the exact evolution of Marcionite beliefs over the decades.
Yeah, but I think he realizes that it's almost impossible to get there, and so the only way he can do it is to kind of, you know, analyze what the Marcionites were saying. I think he realizes that, you know.
Yeah, you mean that it's hard to get back to what Marcion himself believed.
Yeah, like I thought one of the strong points in this chapter was the way he delineated the difference between the dualism and the tripartite Marcionism that followed it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, yeah, Rhodo was pretty short. Did any of you guys have anything to say? It was like just a couple sentences on Rhodo saying that, hey, look, Marcion's followers have changed some of what he believed.
Well, this is the actual. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, many of these were so short that I didn't really take any notes. I just kind of accepted it and moved on, you know?
Yeah, Moll didn't quote anything from Rhodo. He basically just summarized what he, you know, that he found very little there, except that Marcion's original doctrine was dualistic, and it was Marcion's followers who introduced the idea of three principles.
Yeah.
Right.
But he doesn't really substantiate that, except from the footnote. I guess you can follow that text.
Yeah, the whole section is coming from ecclesiastical histories. So
Clement of Alexandria, what's he add?
I guess before we move on to Rhodo, the actual reference that he quotes, I won't quote the whole thing because it's quite big, but what's really interesting is that there's no mention of evil, but he talks like this. This is Marcion's followers he's referencing. These followers of the wolf of Pontus, and like him, unfathomable division of things, become reckless without giving any proof asserted of these principles. Others again, worse in error, inconsistent, unlawful in the natures, and contradictory in their opinions of law. So yeah, there's no mention of good and evil. It's like
No, but it's not. But it sounds like a Fox News broadcast.
yeah, the wolf of Pontus.
It's like this guy's. We're not saying he's evil, but
Yeah. But it's interesting that they talk about they don't give proof and their contradictory natures and their there's no mention of good and evil. It seems to be on nature and it's almost more theological than moral, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know.
well, it's kind of like the opening of Tertullian describing Pontus, where it's like the worst place in the world. You know.
And nothing
I
good
was
can come
wondering-
from there.
I was wondering if we could just like go right to the conclusion.
Yeah.
Of this section?
Before we do
On
that, though,
page
I
80,
thought,
yeah.
before we
Oh.
do that, I think we should. I'd like to say just a little bit about. I thought how he did a really, really good job of being fair when he compared Marcionism or Marcion himself to Gnosticism. I thought he did a really good job in distinguishing between true, or what we think is true Gnosticism, and those elements of Gnosticism that are lacking in Marcion. So we can't
I'm
really
not
call
saying
him
go that far. Just the conclusion part on page 80.
Yeah, we don't need to go for the sources one by one, probably.
Well, if we're going to do that, I just at least wanted to mention Hippolytus, because that was one of the other sources that I thought was really strong for Moll. I'll just read the notes I took on that little section. Hippolytus describes both forms of the dualism, that is good and evil or good and just, but says the good-evil version is the original Marcionite belief, and reports that Prepon or Prepon, a follower of Marcion, introduced the third, that is the just term, to the tripart. This is where you get the tripart, the good, evil, just. Either a good God, just God, evil matter, or good God, just God, evil God. Hippolytus also states that some Marcionites call the demiurge evil, some call him just, and that Marcionites say the just one created the world out of already existing matter. So anyway, I thought that was a strong source. So yeah, now we can go to the conclusion, or if you guys wanted to do any little highlighting, then we can jump ahead.
Just on the Hippolytus before we move on, I also found that really interesting because, I mean, how much we can trust his information is, that's its own issue because he clearly doesn't like the Marcionites. But it is interesting that he seems to be reporting that reading the whole section from Hippolytus, he seems to be just as confused as we are. Like it's so hard to track exactly what each Marcionite sect believes, and it's not like some of the other writers where there's like, oh, it's all the devil's work. It seems reading that full chapter, Hippolytus is trying to sort of figure out what the heck these guys believe. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a parallel, though. If there are so many different variations of Marcionism, I think the analog was true on the other side. If Marcion's church was an anti-church, but on the other side you had the hyper asceticism of someone like Montanus, or the Arians or the Montanists or those people. So they had as many variations on that side as they did on the Marcionite side, I think.
Oh no, I don't think anyone would disagree with that, and that is sort of the strange irony with Hippolytus trying to write a beautiful church history.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on.
Now, I don't know exactly what's from the conclusion on 80. It's a really long section.
Actually, John, maybe you'd like to start since you suggested it. We go there.
Nah.
Well, basically, overall, it seems like a lot of the sources are, a couple of them at least, are saying that there is some change in his followers that from what Marcion actually believed. Several sources say that. One other note I took, I think this is actually in the conclusion, almost positive it is. Every time in any of the sources that there's a report or the description of the demiurge as being just, or that Marcion or Marcionites believe the demiurge is just rather than evil, it's always described that way within the tripartite framework, the tripartite formulation. So they'll never say Marcion was a dualist and just believed in a just and an evil God, and that's it. Whenever they're describing that Marcion or Marcionites believed in a just God, it's always within that tripartite framework, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Except he says origin. That's the one exception where it seems like he may not be actually describing that situation. So, but all the other sources do, apparently. I thought that was interesting.
When reading the conclusion, it was the first time it occurred to me that just as in the case of Gnosticism, where we have the old categories breaking down and we're realizing that there's really no set definition of Gnosticism that would include all the various sects, it seems that these guys in the 3rd century are having the same problem with Marcionism, that there is no set doctrines or formulations that they could say, this is Marcionism. So
Right.
It seems to me that if you conclude then that the term Gnosticism no longer applies or should be rethought, then these guys should have been, we should be looking at them the same way as that they should have probably rethought trying to include all these different sects under Marcionism, because it's too broad a category. It's almost as if there was no such thing as Marcionism really per se.
Yeah, I disagree with that, John.
I knew you would.
Yeah, I wanted to just say one little personal opinion on that, and the thing when it comes to Gnosticism. There's diversity within movements. There's never a monolithic, no variety whatsoever description of probably any human endeavor. So yeah, there's definitely variety, and maybe even a lot of it. And in some cases, it might actually not make sense to say this is Catholicism because there's just too many varieties. So even something as monolithic as Catholicism, there was never a point, even when the church was trying to monitor variety and heresy, that they were fighting against it. You still ended up having variety and stuff like that. But I still think these terms are in general useful, just with the caveat that it's not a monolithic single entity, that there's no variety or marginal variety. You know what I mean? Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does, Doug. And in fact, I want to quote one thing from Moll here. I mean, in spite of this diversity of descriptions of the Marcionite movement and stuff, it is obvious that from a Marcionite point of view, only a tripartite system of thought leaves room for a just God. A good and a just God together can alone offer no answer to the crucial issue of the origin of evil. In other words, one axiomatic principle of Marcionite thinking is that there has to be at least one evil player in the game.
It's very good. Yeah, the reason why I disagree with you, John, is because with Gnosticism, in my opinion, as Williamson has pointed out, like, it has no center. Like, the groups are so different, group to group to group to group. But with Marcionism, much like Orthodoxy in a weird way, or Proto-Orthodoxy, this is going to be a very bad example, never mind. Okay, Marcionism, at least they all claim their heritage with this guy, and they seem to be able to be clustered under this person's ideas. So I think that in itself, sort of what Doug was talking about before, helps us more than anything else. And I think Moll's endeavor isn't so much to define Marcionism, but he's trying to get back to what Marcion himself believed. I think Moll's got no problem with saying Marcionism evolved and became divergent, and it got to the point where could you even call it Marcionism anymore? It's so different group to group. I think Moll might agree with that. We could talk to him about it. I think the point is, what did Marcion the man think? I think that's Moll's task in this. Now, whether we can do that or not, that's a different question, but I think that's Moll's point.
Yeah, I would agree that that's Moll's point.
And I think Moll does a great job of arguing that for Marcion, there has to be at least one evil player in the game.
And that
it's just that once it becomes a tripart deity, like you guys were talking about, it's becoming very, very diverse, where it's no longer the same dualistic theology. It's tripart theology. It's no longer. It brings in the concept of just God, where nothing had like that had been part of the original. It's become so different from Marcionism that the later Marcionism doesn't seem to be really categorizable under that term.
Well, I think he did a good job showing that Marcion's anti-God was Yahweh, and if that's the case, then it's not really it's not a dialectic. It's more of a dualism, or something like that.
Well, he does kind of say it as a dialectic because he's saying there's a dialectical relationship between the good God and the bad God. That the good God is reacting specifically, dialectically, to the actions of the anti-God creator.
Yeah, but he's naming the Jewish God specifically as the bad one, which means that where he brings it up in there somewhere where he says, are they coexistent, or did one spring out of the other? And that's the question. And I think that's the thing that makes it kind of makes no sense to me a little bit to try to posit. It's almost like, to me, I'm always confused in Christianity and Proto-Orthodoxy and in Marcionism. Why would a bunch of Gentile people preach Jewish symbols? Because even Marcion, as much as he detested the Jewish God, why co-opt specifically Jewish symbols to do so?
Do we know that Marcion wasn't a Jew?
We have no idea.
No, but we know that he detested Judaism, at least when he was doing his work.
But notice that he never questions that the Old Testament is true and that Yahweh is the creator. And it seems like he seems to have such an acceptance of this that it almost would have to come from somebody who was himself Jewish or was raised in a Jewish Christian household.
I have to disagree with Leon on this a little bit. I mean, Moll is arguing very specifically here that Marcion did not hate Jews.
Yes.
And that basically that that Marcion thought creation was evil and hated creation, and that Marcion hated the Jewish God and thought the Jewish God was evil. But there's nothing about Marcion saying the Jewish people are evil.
Yeah,
or that Jewish ritual is evil.
I stand corrected. What I meant to say is actually what you're saying now.
Yeah. Just to defend you, though, Leon, you did say Judaism.
Yeah, thank you. But that's kind of what I'm...
You could take that either way, yeah.
He hated the Jewish God.
Yeah. And it's sort of... I really liked the concluding line to that section where it's like, but what else could he have made him believe that the Creator, this evil deity, which he detests so much, was the God of the Jews? The answer is almost anticlimactic because the Old Testament says so. It's...
Well, I was disappointed what he said after that because I was expecting him to say not what he said, but rather that the exclusivity of the Jewish God, which is all over the Old Testament. I am your God. Other gods exist besides me, but they're not for you. The henotheism and that kind of stuff. I expected him to say that was the source, not what he actually did say.
Anyway, I think we're jumping a little bit ahead in the text here. Are we all finished talking about up to page 85?
I think so.
Yeah.
We're in the evil God section for sure.
Yeah. So we'll just start at 86 now then, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so this section, it's called the evil God as the God of the Old Testament, which you guys got the gist of it. And he breaks it down as this God having, I think it's 5 characteristics: creator, lawgiver, judge, non-divine, and a kind of a sixth tacked-on section or attribute, not really to do with the God per se, but that Marcion did believe also in a Jewish Messiah. Jesus wasn't that Messiah. Jesus wasn't the Messiah predicted in the Old Testament, but such a Messiah would come, a warrior Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Jerusalem, etc. So those are the main points. So did you guys want to go over each one and break it down like he does?
I would, yes, because there's things they want to talk about in those, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really like on the part of it being the God of the Jews here, being the demiurge. I find that fascinating what he says in the second paragraph on page 88. The best example to demonstrate Marcion's explicit blame of the Creator instead of his people, however, is his concept of Christ's descent into Hades. According to Marcion, Christ, when he descended into Hades, saved Cain, the Sodomites, the Egyptians, and all the others who were condemned by the Creator, whereas Abel, Enoch, Noah, and all the patriarchs and the prophets were not saved by him. The interesting and often neglected part of this story is the reason why the latter group was not saved. One might perhaps simply assume that they did not follow Christ because they stuck to their own God. However, Irenaeus clearly states that the patriarchs and prophets did not follow Christ because they knew that their God was always tempting them, and so they suspected that he was tempting them again. In other words, they did by no means remain faithful to their God, and therefore refused to follow Christ. But their horrible experience with their God had blinded them and made them lose all hope for salvation.
See, to me, that sounds so much like polemic against existing Jews of his own time that it makes me suspect that that's even in there like that.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think of that, Wayne? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I kind of got lost for words at a point here.
Well, an interesting thing I thought about this was, yeah, it does seem slightly like polemical against Jews, possibly, but you could at least it's definitely polemical against Yahweh. The interesting point too is that if this is an example of an anti-Jewish streak, it seems like, at least according to what Moll's presented us with, it seems like this is the only case or the only place where you can say it's possibly that.
I wouldn't even say that was Marcion's view, though. I would say that's something specifically that, what's his name is talking about there? Irenaeus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read the paragraph from Irenaeus?
Sure.
This is from Irenaeus. Salvation will be attained only for those souls which have learned his doctrine, while the body, as having been taken away from the earth, is incapable of sharing in salvation. In addition to his blasphemy against God himself, he has advanced also this, truly speaking with the mouth of the devil, saying in direct opposition to the truth, that Cain and those like him, the Sodomites and the Egyptians and those like them, and fine of all nations, who have walked in all sorts of abomination, who were saved by the Lord, on his descendants into Hades, on their running unto him, they were welcomed into the kingdom. But that serpent, which was in Marcion, declared that Abel and Enoch and Noah, and those of other righteous men who sprang from the patriarch's bosom, with all the prophets, and those who were pleasing in the eyes of the Lord, they did not partake in salvation. For these men, he says, knew that their God was constantly tempting them, and even now suspected that he was tempting them. They did not learn to Christ, nor did they believe his announcement. And for this reason he declared that their souls remained in Hades. What blasphemy!
So are you saying, John, that you think Irenaeus is trying to make Marcion out to be anti-Semitic? Like,
in a way, it's like saying that, yes, people like Cain, Sodomites, Egyptians, you might be able to read, Gentiles are running to Christ, but not faithful Jews, because,
So you might be interested in this, Leon. The next line after he says, what blasphemy, But since this is the man, Marcion, who is the only one who has openly dared to mutilate the scriptures and unabashedly, above all others, in vain against God, I propose specifically to refute him, convicting him of his own writings. With the help of God, I shall overthrow his discourses and please the apostles, which are my authority, not his. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm assuming Irenaeus is one of the main sources and probably Tertullian and Eusebius. Those are probably the guys where we're getting that Marcion edited the texts, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that Irenaeus is the guy who begins the trajectory, even though he contradicts himself at times. Irenaeus is the guy who really starts to lump heretics together in a genealogy of heresy.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that this almost sort of reeks of that, the fact that Abel and Enoch and Noah, the holy genealogy, are condemned according to Marcion, but the genealogy of evil sort of continues into the underworld. So I'm a little suspect of this myself, actually. I haven't done a lot of research into it, but because I know Irenaeus loves those genealogies, this is interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Wayne, I also like that point on the quote that you quoted. I actually wrote it down here that was an interesting paragraph there.
And we don't get this belief from anybody else, so that's,
Yeah.
Oh wait, it's reported by the medicine chest as well.
So lawgiver, creator, we didn't really talk about other than there's not much to say. I mean, Marcion thought that was the first attribute. Marcion thought he was the creator of the world, Yahweh, Old Testament God. And we just talked about God of the Jews, right? So Marcion thought that was the main thrust of that section B was this demiurge character, however Marcion called him, the creator, Yahweh, was the God of the Jews.
The anti-God, that's the evil God, is the God of the Jews.
Right. And almost seemed like he almost like, I mean, taking Marcion's view, it's almost like this God was picking on the Jews especially, putting up these roadblocks like the law to get them to sin more, and not dispensing his law or applying his law inconsistently.
Well, that's Paul,
contradictory. Sorry?
That's Paul.
Well, yeah.
It's Marcion, but it's through Paul, via Paul.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's still Marcion, though, right?
Yeah. This mostly comes from Tertullian, and because Tertullian, writes 5 books on Marcion, this is where we sort of get, a really big fleshed out idea that the law for Marcion was exactly sort of the way you're talking about it, Doug. That the law is just a rotten deal. It's a really evil, rotten deal, and we're all stuck in it unless we have the grace of Jesus. And he gets that through Paul, particularly Galatians. Galatians is, Marcion's favorite letter.
And Romans, though. Romans, we don't know, but it's part of his list.
It's part of his list, but Galatians is the one he references. Like, Galatians is the one that most of the early church fathers quote when they're referring to Marcion's quotations. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
But
it's pretty. I agree if Romans is in there too, but it's pretty damn obvious. Galatians, you only have to read it to kind of see that it's not that hard to get to the same conclusion Marcion does.
Yeah. And what I thought was interesting is, like, at the beginning of section 3, Moll gives 3 passages from Romans, in this case, talking about he says these passages were crucial to Marcion's understanding of the law. And Paul's, obviously. Maybe. The first one's Romans chapter 3, verse 20. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Okay, that one's not so bad as far as indicting the law. Romans chapter 4, verse 15. The law brings wrath. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. A little heavier. And then the last one, Romans chapter 5, verse 20. The law came in so that transgression might abound.
Yeah, that's kind of nasty name calling, kind of nastiness.
Yeah, and what's interesting is there are definitely other places in Paul's epistles where Paul seems to be contradicting himself on his view of the law. Maybe Daniel will want to say. I mean, I don't want to go on a huge, detour about Paul's view of the law, but there seems to be a lot of different opinions by Paul on what exactly the law means.
Oh, yeah.
I want to insert something here. I'm just checking against Badun's reconstruction of the Apostolicon, and Romans 4:15 is not in what Badun reconstructs.
Okay. What about 520?
Yeah, 320 is. 520 is.
Okay.
But Badun's reconstruction isn't perfect. I mean, there's lots of.
Yeah, I was going to say he probably got it from probably Harnack's reconstruction.
No, he's doing it from scratch.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, from the sources. That's the main value of Badun's book, is that he does his reconstruction from scratch.
Hey Wayne, can you tell me if he includes Romans 7:12 in that, in his reconstruction?
Yeah, looking. Yes. Thus the law is sacred, and its commandment is sacred and just and good.
Because these texts that you cite, that we were just read just now, these three, they don't really say anything negative about the law per se. They only say that the law results in sin or transgression.
Well, this is why I go back to Galatians, because in Galatians 5:1-6, which is in the Apostolicon as well, is people become a slave to the law. Where are we? 5:1, which is.
Well, Moll's picking out verses here that show that the demiurge was the lawgiver. So that's his main point here in this section.
Yeah, Christ sets us free for freedom. Do not let yourselves be confined to the yoke of slavery, which is the law. I testify against the circumcised person who is obligated to fulfill the whole world. No one can do this. We become slave law according to Paul in Galatians. Yeah, and no one can uphold it.
See, that's why we discussed this a little earlier as a preview of this section, but basically I think this is a key in my understanding, is that at least if these texts are all original to Paul, basically I don't see any inconsistency, because Paul never speaks anything against the law per se. He thinks the law is just and perfect, but the fact is, if this evil God, I don't know if Paul would say this, but Marcion does, this evil God created man in a weakness in which he could never fulfill it, and so that's why he's evil. Not because he gave an evil law, because the law was perfect, but because he made man in such a way that he could never attain it, and so he was doomed to fail. That's the reason why he's evil.
I think you just did a really good job of illustrating how Marcion could derive all this from Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like going to an uneducated person with who has no clue, and I want you to write the great next American novel. They can't do it. They just can't even fathom the concept, and any attempt is just doomed in failure to begin with. And the God cackles in delight that that it can't be achieved.
Yeah, I don't want to get in an excursion too long, but I do want to mention one point Badun makes, is that there are things in his reconstruction that he doesn't believe Marcion would agree with, and that's part of the reason that he does not believe Marcion edited the text. That Marcion was actually using a text that he came to him.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it has
we'll get to that.
Marcion didn't necessarily say.
I think I'm looking forward to part 4.
So lawgiver. You guys want to go to judge? This is the other feature, or more on the law?
I think we can go to judge.
Okay. Yeah, judge. This again talks more. It's pretty short. Again, it just talks, kind of emphasizes Moll's point that judge doesn't necessarily mean like someone who dispenses justice.
Yeah, two different words.
Right. Could have a negative connotation, like someone who's judgmental or like harsh.
A judge is just one who decides.
Unfair.
Yeah, one who has discretion, basically.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Not fair. As opposed to fair, that's a good one too, and same with you, Wayne.
I like the last sentence or two of this section. The Old Testament God created man as a compulsive transgressor, gave him the law which he was too feeble to obey, and now judges him for his transgressions. Obviously, this God is playing a very cruel game with his subjects.
Yeah.
Another passage I highlighted. We think alike, Wayne. Very strong words there.
So I quoted that in my thesis. But us, we're all just awesome.
Yeah, it's great. Great writing there. So, anything else on judge? How about unworthy of a god or not divine? What do you guys think of that? That Marcion. Well, I'll just read the first part. After these constitutive elements of this evil God, Marcion points out that the Old Testament God, in fact, lacks all the qualities of a truly divine being, as he has too many human flaws. He changes his mind about people, for example, regarding Saul or Solomon, choosing them first and later rejecting them. He feels repentance, for example, about the wickedness he wanted to do to the Ninevites. Also, after the flood, Moll doesn't put that in there, but he feels sorry he flooded the world. He lacks omniscience. For example, he did not know where Adam was, nor could he foresee that Adam would transgress his commandment. He's inconsistent in his commandments. For example, he forbids making any images, but commands Moses to create a brazen serpent. Apparently, these are things Marcion is believing.
What's again interesting is that this is from Tertullian, not Irenaeus.
Yeah.
And if you look up the references, Tertullian has to go to, because when you look at the footnotes, some of these are whole chapters in books.
Yeah.
And Tertullian has to work really hard to sort of apologetically explain that. So, and to me, theologically, it makes sense. It sort of makes sense that Marcion would think this way, because the God of Jesus Christ is greater and more brings apart salvation and freedom. It sort of makes sense that the evil God would be a lesser divine being to me. So that kind of makes sense. And the fact that Marcion highlights this and that Tertullian has to work so hard, I would buy it. Like, we can't be 100% sure, but it makes sense to me that Marcion would think this way. He would go to this and be like, but guys, like, it's right here.
But if that's the way he sees, if that's the way that Marcion actually saw the anti-God, it kind of, one thing I'd like to say here is it kind of seems that he doesn't really understand the nuances of Second Temple Judaism and Pharisaism.
Oh yeah, no way he does, probably.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And
And
therefore, that kind of informs, it offers an answer to what Shauna was saying. Was this guy Jewish? He kind of doesn't seem to be well informed about the nuances of Judaism. Only
no doubt about that. Yeah.
That is a really good argument, Leon. That's a footnote in itself. That's really good.
You could almost say if he was that well informed, he might be a Jew. Might have been a Jew.
It could be, but he doesn't seem to know about it.
Well, we know in the 2nd century.
Or at least he has a very biblicist. He has a very literal biblicist view of this God, or that it's anti-God, or whatever you call it.
Well, we know Christians in the 2nd century are reading the Old Testament, so we don't know how Marcion got his hands on it, but still, like, we know that certain Christians in certain part of the empire did read it. Like, after all, we have in the 1st century and the 2nd century, the Christians who wrote the Gospels and things like that seem to be able to quote it they know sections of it pretty damn well. So I don't
Right.
see why not. And also, like, what's interesting is that the references Tertullian makes are very famous ones and iconic ones, even if it's just sort of in tradition. Like, you know, it's the Adam and Eve story, which probably, you know, in terms of Jewish cosmology, it's one of the first things you probably would get familiarized with. I'm just spitballing here, but, you know, it's not like Marcion has to exactly sit down with the whole Torah and read the whole thing to find all the contradictions, you know. It's famous stories.
The other thing, too, is that, of course, Jews at the time had answers to all these problems that Marcion's pointing out. I mean, Jews obviously don't read their Bible the same way Marcion was, obviously, but Marcion still could have been even aware of Jewish exegetical polishes, if you want to call them that, to be uncharitable, on some of these difficulties, quote unquote. But that, I mean, even if he was aware of them, it really wouldn't necessarily matter. I mean, you couldn't really say, okay, he definitely knew about him or didn't know about him, because it just could have been that, yeah, he knew about him, but he just disagreed with Jewish exegetical interpretation of these sorts of things, like God's non-omniscience.
Well, he disagrees with the Christians. Like, he disagrees with because he is a Christian, but he disagrees with the proto-Orthodox.
Right.
Because, you know, when he has his tuffle in Rome, apparently, they reject his theology, and he can't see their theology as right as well. You know, like Tertullian says, he thinks my gospel's wrong, I think his gospel is wrong. Yeah, like, clearly Marcion has interactions with other ways of reading the scripture. He just rejects them and promotes his own.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Like, in some of the cases, at least, Marcion would have been familiar with the Christian ways of getting out of these difficulties, because in some of the cases, at least, they would have been the same ways the Jews got out of them. You know, so he would have at least been familiar with some of these apologetic arguments, at least through the intermediary of Orthodox Christianity, or whatever you want to call it.
Which lends credence to Moll's argument that Marcion was first Orthodox somehow, even though he can't quite describe what kind of orthodoxy he followed. It's a good argument that he started out in some kind of that he somehow took a quantum leap somewhere along the way.
Can I ask a question that's kind of a side point here, but I'm so curious I want to ask if anybody knows.
Go for it.
About the history of monotheistic maltheism. That's the belief that there is only one God, but that God is evil. And it's a pessimistic view. That we're just stuck with it.
Do you know how old it is, or is that what you're asking?
That's what I'm asking, yeah. Do you know how old that is?
No, I don't.
Did it exist in Marcion's time or before his time?
That would be a good question to know.
Yeah, I didn't even know that there was such a belief system that there was only an evil God, and we're out of luck.
Isn't that like some? I guess modern Satanism is some kind of a variant on that.
Anyway, back to Marcion. Sorry, Wayne, but like I think
that's fine. I didn't want to get sidetracked too much. I was just curious if anybody knew of any history of that.
It's an interesting thought, and one I will investigate. That sounds fascinating.
Okay, so
shall we move on to the Gunkel?
I just wanted to say that I find it fascinating that this tendency toward a literal interpretation that Marcion takes in some of these texts to just see a very lowly, simple figure in Yahweh because of these texts and his limitations. This is the same way that some evangelicals, though there are a fringe, somewhat the open theists like Dr. Price's buddy Greg Boyd. He's often criticized because he takes a very literal view of some of the texts that seem to indicate that God doesn't know about certain things, or he discovers things as he goes along. He doesn't know the future, and only discovers it like the rest of us. And most evangelicals, my understanding is that they would say that that basically, I've read one article where a scholar tried to say that every text in the Bible is analogical when it comes to describing God, that it never describes him directly as he is per se, but in comparison or in anthropomorphic language. So most wouldn't feel comfortable to force the text as Marcion's doing, but there are a few that do.
Doesn't Origen take Marcion to task for being too literalistic? Doesn't Moll mention that?
Well, when Moll gets his Protestant hat on, yes, like, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so Creator's Messiah. This is another really short section, just basically saying Moll's view is that, you know, Marcion even took this literally, that, yeah, a Messiah is predicted in the Old Testament. It's just that it wasn't Jesus. But this Messiah will come and will do the things that the Old Testament supposedly predicted. A warrior Messiah, conquering Messiah is going to restore the kingdom of Israel, etc., etc., etc.
Well, you know, he wasn't alone in thinking that. When Marcion supposedly went to Rome, it was really only like 10 years after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which, you know, was all about the appearance of a warrior Messiah.
Yeah, good point, yeah.
I personally found this the most fascinating part of the whole thing that we read, because I had never heard it before, this idea that Jesus could be a Messiah, but not the Jewish Messiah. Because I've argued with, to be honest, even Christian friends that I've been open enough to tell why I didn't think Jesus could possibly be the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, and they somehow didn't seem to care. Like, but to take it out, I mean, in my mind, if Jesus wasn't the Jewish Messiah, he was no Messiah, but somehow Marcion found another category. Here's another Messiah from another competing God, apparently, who brought his own Messiah to almost to undo what the Jewish Messiah would have to do.
Yeah,
Well,
without just taking us off topic too long, Isaiah, I think it's chapter 53, I think it's the right chapter, where it's talking about the suffering servant passage. Yeah, there's parts in there where Christians take the beginning of it literally, you know, where, I forget what's exactly in that passage and what's in Psalms, so I get them mixed up. But there's a part at the end where it says he'll have, like, you know, God will prolong his days and he'll have many children and stuff. Christians take the beginning part literally, but they have to allegorize the ending part in order to make it apply to Jesus. And if Marcion's taking the latter half of that more literally, you know, that's part of the reason they don't think Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah, this is in the book, The Origins of Anti-Semitism. I'm trying to think of the author of it. He has a whole chapter on Marcion because for a long time Marcion has been so connected with anti-Judaism, Marcion's the real reason why Christians hate Jews. It's all Marcion's fault, and he completely destroys that idea principally on this belief, where it's like, nope, Marcion seems to believe that the Jews, the nation of Israel, you know, will still have some sort of fulfillment at the eschaton. So yeah, I'll get the book for you. It was a really fascinating. Yeah, Marcion is not the reason why Christians grew
That's
up.
the whole puzzle to me. To me, that's the whole puzzle: is why are these people quoting Jewish scriptures when they're trying to evangelize the Gentiles? It's freaky.
You mean the Orthodoxy, or whatever you want to call it?
The Marcionites and the Orthodox.
Well,
Marcion, by definition, is Gentile and wants everybody to be Gentile. But I think that even the Orthodoxy was primarily Gentile, and something I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Well, he gets to it at a certain point in this book. I don't know if we've gotten to it yet. He addresses the question of why is there's clearly a connection between the two gods, and why is it, for example, from Marcion's point of view, why is it that Jesus would be sent to the Jews, for example, if he had no connection with the Jewish God? And he makes a point that
that's like, I think, the central mystery of it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's hold off on that part real quick because we're coming right into that section, so we may as well do that section in order. But that is coming up real quick. So the good God, and the first section is Christology. What do you guys think about Christology? Basically, this good God is the good God described in the New Testament and Paul's writings. That's the general definition there. And that, again, Jesus is not the Messiah that was predicted in the Old Testament.
It is interesting because my thesis spent a lot of time focusing on Gnosticism's Christology versus Marcion's. One of the things that's really interesting in terms of their difference, which Moll gets into later, but in terms of their Christology, Marcion still seems to believe the general schema of the Orthodox Church that Christ died for sins, that Christ's death, Christologically speaking, saves people, that his death is atoning in some respects. How that happens is really hard because none of his opponents go into great detail about, his actual systematic theology, his systematic Christology, because the most we're going to get, Christologically speaking, is that he appears to be a docicist. But it's interesting that Marcion still believes that Jesus' death had something to do with the formula of salvation.
Yeah, the Christology thing, like reading that whole section, I basically got, like you said, that he's basically a docetist. That's the most we can say with some kind of certainty or not certainty, but plausibility. And Moll mentions Luke chapter 4 verse 30, which really quick. I'll just read it as probably something Marcion would have clued in on to get that docetist non-flesh Jesus. Like he's not fleshly incarnate. He's just like he came to earth in the appearance of a man. And Luke chapter 30 is chapter 4 verse 30 is where he's said to walk through the crowds on his way. So anyway, I thought that's not really. There's probably better cases for docetism, maybe not in Luke, and I know Marcion was apparently only using Luke, but in some of the other Gospels even there's better cases. But yeah, if Marcion was using them, then I guess it doesn't matter. So anything else on that? You guys want to go to Christ's battle against the Old Testament God?
Yes.
I thought this was really interesting.
By the way, I did want to mention that he mentions at this very point in the article or in the book, why did the good God wait so long to reveal himself if he had never revealed himself until Jesus came? So what was you could understand from a Jewish perspective, God's been revealing himself right from the beginning, always, gradually.
Yeah.
Keeps sending prophets, people, and finally he sends his own son. But in Marcion's point of view, that good God has chosen never to reveal himself until this late date. And why now? And it almost seems like the good God is forced into action, like has no real interest in the creation, but is forced into action once the evil God misrepresents things. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to me that Marcion definitely has a theology that he's inherited, but that he's trying to make sense of, and that he's modifying things to try to put the pieces together in a way that's more logical in his mind.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I liked was on page 96, the second paragraph. He says, and this is a quote from Against Heresies, he dissolved the prophets and the law, and this is Marcion's view of Christ's mission, essentially. He dissolved the prophets and the law and all the works of the God who made the world. Now, back to Moll. This one line contains Irenaeus' summary of the purpose of Christ coming according to Marcion, and as so often, Irenaeus summarized very skillfully. Tertullian's report about Marcion's idea that Christ came to destroy the law and the prophets confirms Irenaeus' impression, and also Hippolytus agrees when he states that, according to Marcion, the good God destroyed the works of the demiurge, or the evil god, or the creator god. The crucial phrasing in these passages is the terms dissolve and destroy. Tertullian repeatedly speaks of the... Well, anyway, I don't want to go into all that.
Yeah.
He makes some vocabulary arguments there that I don't really need to read, but the gist of it is in that first part. That Christ was sent by the good God. Sorry?
I'm just saying, I guess to Leon's phrase here that he likes, that the second God could not exist without the first. He is a pure anti-God. You know?
Right, yeah.
I like what Moll says on page 99 here. In this way, Tertullian has apparently, without fully realizing it, once more stumbled over the key to Marcion's anti-interpretation of the gospel. It is not enough that Christ was heard, but it was imperative that he was heard instead of the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, and that's where he's talking about the transfiguration scene. Jesus goes up the mountain, Moses and Elijah appear, and the voice from heaven, you know, Jesus heads up like a light bulb, and a voice from heaven, God, says, this is my son. What does he say? Listen to him, or something like that.
Yeah, this is my son.
Yeah, and Moll's saying that Marcion's view was that Jesus is here to replace those guys, essentially, Moses and Elijah. The Old Testament prophets, Jesus is here to correct and replace. What did I write here? I wrote a note on this. Yeah, Marcion viewed the transfiguration of Jesus in the presence of Moses and Elijah as an inauguration of his message and mission over and above the Old Testament prophets as a correction of them. Yeah. I thought that was interesting. Where does that come from, by the way? Is this reported to us, this apparent interpretation of Marcion of this scene?
It's from Against Marcion, book 4.
So from Tertullian, okay.
Yeah. That's from.
But is he really saying that, Doug? Is he really saying that Jesus is saying something better, correct? Or he's just saying, don't listen to the Old Testament God, period?
I think what you said is what he's saying. The last thing you said. That.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounded like you were saying that. Okay, you know what's coming afterwards is.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, not as I meant as a correction of them, like against the Old Testament prophets.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, to correct it means that okay, what he said was right up to a point, but I'm correcting it rather than saying I'm totally reputing it as if it, shut up.
Yeah, I should have used repudiate then. That's what I meant. That stronger language, like this is the message from the good God through Jesus. Don't listen to the Old Testament prophets. They were listening to the evil demiurge. They're all wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like what he said right after that. Now, it is certainly possible that Tertullian might simply be making these things up, and it's like Moll was reading my mind at that point, I think, because that was my whole impression, is that just how much of this stuff is made up.
So skeptical, John.
I know.
Yeah, I'm with him.
You go, Leon.
I just said I'm with him.
So I'm skeptical to a point, but I really like Joseph Tyson's section on this in his book Luke, Acts, and Marcion. He has a whole chapter about his sources, and within that chapter there's a really good section about why, to a certain degree, he trusts Tertullian and Irenaeus and Justin. Like, he realizes their limitations. He realizes that they love to like, name and shame their opponents in legal Satan and all that. But Tyson sets up a really good formula.
To translate, I think he's expressing kind of the reason why his Bayesian estimation of the probability of that is pretty good, and that's cool. I appreciate that. I actually like Tyson's book a lot. So.
Well, 3 days to my birthday, so if you guys want to send me a book and convince me.
Actually, a good book, John.
Any one that you guys mentioned.
But that basically Tyson's point is that Tertullian would not have made up something like this. Okay, that's not correct. That Tyson's point is that because of the lengths Tertullian goes to sort of undo Marcion's logic, and sometimes that Tertullian puts himself into corners because it appears that Marcion sort of outwitted him or made a really good point, and the fact that he's trying to diverge people away from people who have contact with Marcionites, there's no need for him to go out of their way to completely misrepresent what Marcion's talking about. And that they're probably working to the best of their ability what they know about Marcion. So those sort of things like help me trust them a little bit more. And this sort of thing about Marcion's Christology makes a lot of sense to me. The fact that I can like read this myself probably helps, where I'm like, yeah, Marcion sort of makes a good point, and he's not making sort of leaps of faith over here. Anyway, I need to get going, guys. It's late in Kansas, but this is always fun. I will see you guys on the Facebooks and the Twitter sphere and such, and looking forward to listening to this in the morning. Night all.
Good night.
Thank you, Daniel. I felt a little sad that we didn't get time to discuss the next section with you, because that was one of the more interesting sections to me, and the one that needs the most further reworking of it.
Yeah.
Spent so much time on the good and just God business. We could have gone to the more interesting stuff with you.
I know, but there's always next time, and his whole parallels to Gnosticism, you can see where I disagree and agree with him in my thesis on academia. So
yeah, and next time, Daniel, if you want to say a few words just for the sake of the Hangout, at the beginning of next Hangout, feel free to talking about the Gnostic section if you want. That's fine. So.
Oh, cool. All right.
Just to start us off for next time. Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
A couple of the things I thought was interesting on the Jesus, like as coming as to oppose Yahweh and everything Yahweh's been saying was in Jesus' mission was Moll gives the two examples, Jesus' healing of the leper. So in Jewish law, something you should stay away from, it would make you unclean. And then the woman with the issue of blood, again, stay away from blood. Jesus, the woman not only touches Jesus, but he also heals her.
Right. Moll also stresses that he does it to spite the Jewish God, not necessarily to help the woman.
Right, exactly. And that, again, these may be described in, were these described in, again, Tertullian? These interpretations by Marcion of these two pericopes in the Gospel. I don't remember exactly. I think it is, but I thought those were interesting.
Let me ask you guys, what did you think of that section? Because I thought, well, what did you think about that? Wayne, I'm kind of curious to hear from.
Section 2.1, you mean?
Yeah, the one that we're...
The testimony of the Gospel according to Luke.
Christ's battle against the Old Testament, I think he means. Yeah?
Yeah, like...
I lost track
right,
where we're at here.
Did Jesus come, according to Marcion, did Jesus come to oppose... If Jesus came to oppose directly the Jewish God?
Yeah, I think he argues well that was Marcion's view, yes.
Yeah, I found it pretty convincing too.
Really?
The thing with the leper and the woman, that I guess that may have been Marcion's view, but those particular views of Marcion I don't really find convincing. Whether or not they're Marcion's view, yeah, I guess it's up in the air. But then again, all this stuff is, so.
By the way, when we talk about these things, which I find extremely interesting, I find it more interesting because not necessarily what did Marcion think, but particularly, I'm always curious when we look at Marcion, like how much did he understand Paul better than we do? And so what did Paul think on these things? Did Paul think that Jesus did these things because he had a negative... I mean, anyway, as we all know, Paul says hardly anything about what Jesus did anyway. But do you think he had this attitude that Jesus came negatively against the law from the beginning, and Was a response to the...
I think that Paul wasn't that far in. I think that Marcion kind of extrapolated from Paul and not the other way around. Obviously.
Yeah, same here. I think Paul is just something that Marcion inherited, as a source, and then Marcion just had to make sense of it in his own head. And he had a weird way of doing it.
When you perform really weird, un-Jewish midrash on Paul, what you get is Marcion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard some people say that, well, Marcion was the original Paulinist, and Paul's epistles were basically Marcionism. Marcion wasn't doing any kind of weird interpretation of them. It's really the late Orthodox Church that edited Paul's epistles to make them sound Orthodox. But I don't know. I think Marcion interpreted. I think Marcion did as much loose interpretation of Paul as the Orthodox Church ended up doing, and maybe even editing.
Yeah, I believe the Orthodox Church, heavily interpreted the Pauline letters. I think they made them like a third longer from all the interpolations.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised if Marcion did that too, in the case of Paul's letters, anyway.
I actually don't think so. There's evidence from comparison to the old Latin texts that talk about that. It seems to be evident that the Pauline epistles were very close to what Marcion had before Marcion's time.
I agree with that, and I think I would suggest there's a really cool writing out there by Beidoun, where I posted it last time.
Yeah.
You guys should really read that because it really goes into detail on this very question, and I think he's right.
Yeah,
I think they had parallel trajectories. Probably Marcion's was in existence first, but they didn't follow. The other didn't follow very far behind. It was a parallel trajectory of editing and interpolation and what have you. Anyway, Beidoun makes a really good case for that. I would really recommend that PDF I posted last week.
I'm not sure what Wayne was arguing. Could you re-summarize that, Wayne?
My point is that the text of Paul that Marcion is likely to have been using wasn't his own creation. It was something that he inherited from other sources. And part of the evidence for that was mentioned. Well, there's an article by Giles Quispel. I forget how to spell his name, but that talks about the old Latin texts and looking at variant readings that are in it. And it seems to show evidence that even before Marcion came to Rome, Rome had a text of Paul that seemed pretty close to what we believe Marcion had.
So you're saying there was like Marcion-like text before Marcion?
No, I'm saying there are Pauline texts before Marcion, and that's what Marcion used, and he just gave his own interpretation to them.
Oh, okay.
Well, I think Marcionites gave interpretation to them, but I think he was loyal to whatever he found, whatever he inherited.
So you're saying that Paul was like a Marcionite?
Textually, I think he was loyal to the text. Ideologically, I'm not so sure.
So you're saying Marcion never created his own text, but just commented on what he received?
Yes, what he received. What he received is what he commented on. Exactly that.
But I do think Marcion's interpretation is probably novel, and not necessarily what Paul had intended.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with that too.
So, for example, there's a point that Moll makes, I forget where it's at, where he refers to a text of Paul in Corinthians. I think it's related to the law, and he says that he thinks that Marcion must have taken that out of the text. Would you then disagree and say that the Orthodox later added that text? I forget which one.
Exactly, Dale. I think Moll has that completely backwards about how these texts came to be.
Yeah, I think this is going to be, Chapter 4 is going to be really, really animated.
So in a sense, Doug, it sounds almost like these two, Wayne and Leon, are saying just what you were suggesting. Well, you mentioned how you've heard people say that the Marcionites were the original Paulinists, that they represent Paul's theology from the beginning, and that's what I was wondering about. But it seems like you guys seem to think, I mean, the two of you possibly, that perhaps they were closer to a truer understanding of Paul than the Orthodox Church. Would you say that or not?
Yeah, I would. Well, not quite. I would say that Beidoun is right in that they weren't. One didn't really precede the other. They were parallel trajectories of interpolation and editing and whatnot.
Well, what would you guys say to the most radical view that Marcion actually composed the original Pauline letters in some form and that they were redacted?
I do not.
I would say that there's evidence for and against both views, and that's what drives Beidoun to come to his conclusion.
Now, Beidoun allows for a little bit of editing by Marcion of the text, but very insignificant compared to how much editing was done by the later Catholics and Orthodox.
Right, which is why I also believe that Marcion probably got a head start.
Well, what's interesting too is some of his opponents say that Marcion said that he was restoring the originals from the corruption of the Orthodox or whatever. But hold on, let me finish this thought. But it's interesting, like, why would they say that when all they would really have to say is that Marcion edited the originals? Like, if they wanted to say something against Marcion, they could just say Marcion edited the originals, rather than saying, well, Marcion's saying he's restoring our edits. Like, that's a weird way to attack Marcion when the direct way would just be like, oh yeah, Marcion just edited our originals, rather than saying Marcion's restoring.
It is a weird thing to say. I agree with that, but it's not really it's not the weirdest thing Tertullian has said in his polemic.
I think Tertullian just takes for granted that his version of the epistles he got is the original because that's what he has and that's what's canon. So since Marcion's text was different from him, the only conclusion he was left with was that Marcion took things out.
But yeah, I think this is going to be. I'm gonna dive into reading chapter 4 because I think this is where the roasting succulent meat is going to roast on the fire.
I think we should go back to Moll here, and I think Moll makes some good points about differences between Marcion and Paul. Like on page 100, despite the obvious importance that soteriology has to Marcion, the traditional portrait of him being above all a loyal disciple of Paul must be regarded as more than exaggerated. See chapter 4. For even in the two men's interpretation of Christ's death, we find substantial difference. And he mentions on the next page, more easily put, one could be forgiven a sin that one has committed first. But this situation presupposes that the condemnation and the forgiveness of the sin is performed by one and the same agent, for which Paul and Luther obviously was the one God of the two testaments. Once one separates these two gods, however, the said dialectic expires, since it does not make any sense for Marcion's good God to forgive sins which only exist as a violation of the evil God's law.
Yeah, with the caveat that I wouldn't equate, Luther's Protestantism with Paul necessarily, but yeah, I see his point, and I thought I said it before. I think this chapter was pretty cool. He argued it pretty well.
Yeah.
What I really keyed in on, and I wish Daniel was still here, because Daniel mentioned earlier that he was saying that Marcion appears to have still had some kind of view of Christ's death, of Marcion's soteriology was salvific, kind of salvation from sin, basically. But, and I could be wrong, I hope I'm paraphrasing Daniel right, I think he said something along those lines. But and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, I was reading Moll. Well, let me tell you the note that I put for Moll's view on that. I put, to Marcion, I'm summing up Moll's argument here. To Marcion, Christ's death was not an act to absolve humans of their sin, but rather to redeem, quote unquote, or purchase humans from their possession and bondage suffered under the dominion of the demiurge.
That's my understanding too. That he's just rescuing them from the clutches of the evil god. That's all. That's the salvation.
Right, and the other interesting point was, and I'll talk to Daniel outside of the Hangout or maybe at the beginning of next time about this because I wanted his view, but the other interesting thing is Luke's gospel, which is the gospel that Marcion used, has nothing about Jesus dying for our sins. Even our version of it has nothing about that.
That's a good observation, and I think that's true.
Yeah.
In fact, it's in Luke that we find the phrase that it mentions that Jesus came, who gave his life as a ransom for many. So this ransom teaching is the idea that it was a purchase or an exchange to buy back the people who were who belonged to another god, basically, belonged to the demiurge. I think that comes from Luke, right? The ransom teaching.
Yes.
Yeah.
By the way, Dr. Price seems to think that this is original that this was Paul's way of thinking about the ransom as well, that he had this view that all mankind belonged to the Creator as a result of him creating them, and now Christ he's come to reveal the true God who's come to buy us back from that evil God, that this was really, obviously, when Price explains this, he doesn't explain it as Marcion's view. He really thinks this is Paul's view.
That's interesting, yeah. Anyway, that's how I read Marcion. I'm sorry, that's how I read Moll's summary of what Marcion thought. Sounds like you guys...
Well, I mean, Marcion got it from somewhere, right? That's the point we were trying to make before.
Yeah, exactly. But just how loosey-goosey he was playing with his source texts, who knows, you know? Same goes for anybody reading Paul or whoever, so...
So I think the point that Moll is trying to make in this section, though, is that we can definitely identify in Marcion's thought that that Marcion identified the New Testament God with his good God. I mean, that's a definite thing we can accept.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what Moll was trying to show. We do have evidence for that, because Moll is going through point by point what we have evidence for.
Right.
Which brings up the question, a Messiah that's not Jewish is kind of what the hell is that?
It's from the good God.
Right.
No one, remember, what does it say in Luke's Gospel? He quotes it. No one knows God but the Son, and no one knows the Son but through God. I'm probably slaughtering it.
Is that the John quote?
No, this one's from Luke. I forget.
No one knows the Son but through the Father, or whatever.
Right. Hold on.
I think you had that backward. I mean, no one knows the Father except the Son, I thought you had.
There you go.
Where was that? I know he quoted it in here.
Luke 10:22.
Yeah, Luke
Thank
10.
you, yeah. Want to read it, John?
Yeah, from the pre-Nicene New Testament.
Uh-oh.
All things were delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows who the Father is except for the Son, and him to whom the Son deigns to reveal him.
Right.
Yeah. So that does kind of seem like, yeah, this is an entirely new thing we're dealing with here,
No one has ever known this God until now, which is
until I've come.
Which I think that Tertullian's critique of that was actually quite good. It's probably the best thing I've read from Tertullian.
There's something missing from that verse, by the way. It's with Harnack and Julius Wellhausen, I have omitted, quote, who the Son is except the Father, nor, as a later interpolation. So there's actually two parts of that. All things were delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows who the Father is except the Son, and no one knows who the Son is except the Father, something like that.
I should actually quote that passage from Badoon's reconstruction. Badoon has almost a full page of notes just on these two verses, because there's evidence that the Marcionite version of the text actually read slightly differently. Not just a matter of whether a verse is included or not, but actually a different reading. He said, I thank you and praise you. Lord of the celestial sphere, because these things were hidden from learned and intelligent people, you have revealed to novices. Yes, Father, because you do thus become gratifying to you. Everything has been confided to me by the Father, and no one has known the Father. No one has known who the Father is except the Son, nor recognizes who the Son is except the Father, and the one to whom the Son discloses it.
Isn't there another text where Jesus says something like, "You have not, neither have you known him"?
It sounds, yeah, that sounds Johannine to me.
Yeah.
So do you guys want to go to Marcion and Gnosticism, or did you anything else on the section we're already in?
I think we're good in this section. We kind of read through the last couple sections, though, in a manner that we didn't really explain to the audience what Moll's point was. Like he's arguing, we do have evidence that the evil God that Marcion's talking about is the Old Testament God, and we have evidence that that his good God is the New Testament God.
Right.
And that's all Moll's trying to show here. So some of these other issues are kind of secondary. I mean, he's very narrow in what his focus is.
Right. He's trying to get at what he's trying to reconstruct Marcion's view on these things, on who these two gods were. Right, basically.
But yeah, the parallels to Gnosticism section, we should go through that.
Okay. So I'm assuming nothing else on.
He did a really fair job in his analysis of the when he compared and contrasted Marcionism with Gnosticism. I think he did a pretty fair and even-handed job of being accurate when he went down the whole list of, I forgot whose list of traits, characteristics of Gnosticism he was using the definition, but he went down the list of all of them, and I think he was pretty accurate on all that.
Not sure I can pronounce the name, but the list is by Christoph Markchees.
Thank you. Yeah, that list. I think there were 10 of them or 8 of them or something.
8, yeah.
I want to hear Daniel's take on that list.
Me too. Basically, I did a really quick summary of them. The similarities: 1, there's an otherworldly, distant, supreme God. These are similarities between Marcionism and Gnosticism. 2, evil matter and creation, and humans' alienation from it. Although that second part, and humans' alienation from it, Moll is arguing that that's not Marcionism. That's something specific to Gnosticism.
And Moll makes a point there I want to emphasize.
Yeah.
For Marcion, man is made entirely by the evil creator, and there is no part in him which would not belong to his creation.
Right, yeah.
And that's actually part of him he disagrees with other Gnostics about, because other Gnostics believe it's like a divine, a spark from the good God, inside the evil body.
Exactly, yeah. 3 of similarities, the demiurge, a creator god, as opposed to the supreme good God. Though for Marcion, the two gods are not interrelated or interdependent. Like in Gnosticism, like Wayne was hinting at, this demiurge kind of split off from the supreme God. But Marcion doesn't seem to have an understanding like that. And then 4 of the similarities of dualism, or basically just the two gods, and then also possibly a dualism between spirit world and matter, which I don't remember if Marcion talked about the spirit versus matter dualism. Do you guys remember? But obviously he makes a good case that Marcion was a dualist as far as the gods, two gods.
Yeah, it's a different kind of a way, because the Gnostics will have a spiritual part in man that is from a different source than our material bodies and stuff.
Right.
That's not what Marcion is saying. Marcion is saying man's almost entirely from the Creator, but the good God is seeing the situation and purchasing him away from him.
Yeah, I always have an issue when people describe Marcionism as Gnosticism.
So you take. So basically, do you agree with Moll overall that there's major
I agree with him
differences?
overall. I agree with him overall that there are some similarities, but there are some other points where he's very definitely not Gnostic.
Yeah.
Well, Moll has a second list here of the differences.
Yeah.
So Leon, we were talking earlier, Doug, you made a comment about basically there's such a variety among Gnostics, just as there's a variety in Christianity. And you could easily say, well, look at the Greek Orthodox and how different they are from the evangelicals. So they're not Christians at all. I mean, you could say the same thing about Marcion compared to the Gnostics, but isn't there enough there that you would say, isn't there a general similarity to where you could say they come from the same cloth, and I might as well just call them?
I think I actually side with Moll in the sense that I don't see. Let me see how I can phrase this, because I'm kind of. I'm going to lose my train of thought, but yeah, I kind of go with Moll. I don't think that it's the same God, if that makes sense.
I mostly asked because I had heard Stephen Heller, I think, who is an expert on Gnosticism. I heard him once make the case. He wasn't specifically addressing Marcionism, but he basically was talking about how he wanted to be open to the use of Gnosticism for such a broad range of groups that he didn't feel comfortable excluding people that are often excluded from the camp. And he made that comparison to Christianity, saying there's such a broad range that are part of the umbrella of Christianity, and the same thing with Gnosticism, and he felt comfortable just to say, you got to be comfortable with that variety, and you can't.
I understand where he's coming from, but to me, or at least from what I understand about Gnosticism, the Gnostic demiurge, it's not an anti-God, really. The demiurge and the real God, to me, it doesn't really sound the same.
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, where I think Marcion, had a lot of theological constructs handed to him. Here's this Old Testament, and here's these stories about Jesus, and here are these letters of Paul, and he basically, had to make sense of them in his own head, and he found his own system of doing that. I think a lot of the Gnostic teachers, other Gnostic teachers, did that again, and they may have solved some of the issues the same way Marcion did. But some of the issues they solved in a completely different way than Marcion did, and I think it's just taking what has been passed down to them and making sense of it in their own minds.
I think Gnosticism and Marcionism, I think that whole sort of view of like the dualism God, an evil or just God, and then a good God. A lot of that stuff I think just comes out of like Platonism, Middle Platonism, and you can. The thing with definitions and categories is like you can blow out the boundaries of a category so it's all encompassing, and all these different things can fall under this term, or you can shrink the borders down and you can start kicking stuff out. And where the demarcation lines are drawn, I think. It's just.
Well, I would.
What's the point of talking about what falls and what doesn't?
I would agree with you, except I think that in Marcion's case, he very, very specifically specified it's the Jewish God.
Right. Yeah. But some Gnostics did that too, right?
Not really. That's
Gnostic Christians.
Gnosticism.
Yeah. Regarding how we define like Gnosticism and Marcionism, where we make the boundaries at, it's almost like we could go back to John Marshall's Parable of War and reread his early chapters again. Because it's the same kind of issues that we had there.
And it's the same problem in biology. Like, where do you draw the line of when's it a separate species? You get into these problems. Not everything can be clearly categorized into a neat, tidy box, you
Yeah,
know.
but
So there's going to be stuff on the fringes that it's going to be hard to decide whether it fits in your category or not.
Well,
so
if I'll say, Dale, you ask a really good question. You know, do I think there's enough there? I'm not sure. I'd kind of signing on no. Mostly because I don't think I don't think the theologies are similar.
Anyway, for our listeners, we should probably go through Moll's list of traits which separate Marcion from Gnostics.
yeah. Do you want me to just go through them real quick? There's just three. So one's splitting off or creation of other divine beings.
So no pleroma in Marcion, because the Gnostics
have the
pleroma.
Yeah, you're not getting like Sophia.
Right, that's what I'm
splitting off from Sophia.
I don't see any of that in Marcion.
Yeah.
And Moll agrees, yeah.
And then concept of the pleroma, the drama in the heavens, this cosmology of divine sparks separating and falling down to earth and getting trapped in human bodies, and there's no concept of like a predestination of a separate, unique class of people who happen to have like the divine spark within them. Marcion doesn't seem to have anything like that. And then the final one, which is another big one, is there's really no concept of gnosis or secret knowledge in Marcionism. In order to like, rejoin the pleroma.
Gunkel made a really good point about that. For Marcion, it's not knowledge. It's just salvation because of grace or whatever, because of Pauline justification, you know.
That would make it sound like Marcion would be a universalist, but based on the point, the quote from Tertullian we talked about earlier, it kind of said he wasn't. So, do you think Marcion was a universalist? I believe everybody would eventually be saved.
Well, what I mean is, like, in the case of Gnosticism, there just happen to be certain people that have a divine spark. It's almost like Calvinism. Like, some people have it and some people don't, and that's that. But Marcionism, there's still probably a distinction between people who will end up being saved and then people who won't accept Christ and won't be saved. So I don't think it's necessarily universalist, but it's not kind of a predestination thing like it is in the case
Moll
of
specifically says that Marcion takes his theology from the Old Testament, not from Paul. So the idea of salvation through grace that you mentioned again would be foreign to his thinking.
Yeah. I do want to buttress my question by the observation from some other, I forget the name person to cite here, but in the early churches, we know about half of the churches were universalists in the 2nd century. So it's not like a rare thing. It was like pretty much the norm to believe everybody would be saved. The Catholic view that some people would be damned was almost, like a 60-40 kind of thing, the minority view.
So, yeah, overall, as far as the categories, I honestly don't even think the categories are that useful as far as arguing what falls into it or not. I mean, I'm saying Gnosticism is a useful category. Whether or not Marcion is technically a Gnostic, I don't think that necessarily matters, because he's on the fringe.
There's different people coming up with different solutions to these theological and Christological problems.
Right. Yeah.
I think by any definition that he's non-Gnostic, I think.
That he's non-Gnostic?
Yeah, because even though, even Moll points out, there's ideas floating around at the time that, just because he has similarities with them that makes him Gnostic. No.
Yeah. And what do you guys think about, like, Platonism influencing not just possibly Marcionism, but also Gnosticism?
Oh, definitely. I'm sure there's Platonism
definitely.
in Paul. I mean, already in Paul there's Platonism.
So then we could say, well, is Middle Platonism Gnosticism, or is Gnosticism just Middle Platonism with some add-ons?
I think it's more useful to define Gnosticism in a way that is more specific to certain 2nd century groups, like the Valentinians and others.
Well, what I was curious about too is the author you mentioned that made up this list of 8 distinctives of Gnosticism. Do all quote quote-unquote Gnostic sects, do they all have at least these 8 features? Like, is this the core of Gnosticism?
That's the claim. That's the claim, and Moll agrees with the gentleman. What was his name? Michel.
Mark Scheist.
Christoph Mark Scheist.
Okay, that's the claim that Moll makes. He accepts his listing as a good definition, I suppose.
Yeah, he cites the book Gnosis and Introduction by Christoph Mark Scheist.
But there are books, recent books, that claim that there are really no Gnostic distinctives that would apply to every group.
That's what I'm wondering. And if that's the case, then you could argue that, say, something that has traditionally been classified as Gnosticism, like, I don't know the details of, like, Valentinianism or something, but did Valentinianism, as far as we know, did it adhere to all, say, 8 of these bullet points?
I don't know.
And if it didn't, is it Gnostic?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point you make, and I think that Moll presumes that that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we should define these terms in a way that, like John Marshall would have, argued for, that it fits in the category if it meets, enough of the criteria, even though it may not meet every criteria.
Well, then you have to ask yourself, yeah, it's true that Marcionism doesn't have, like, the splitting off of divine beings, he doesn't have the drama and the pleroma, and yeah, he doesn't have secret knowledge. But he does have the similarities of an otherworldly, distant supreme God, evil matter in creation, he has the idea of the demiurge, he has 2 gods, so is there something about those 3 differences that are too critical to Gnosticism to make him not be a Gnostic?
Yes, that goes right to the heart of the question that Dale asked me just a little while ago. And I would say yes, especially the matter having to do with Pleroma and Sophia and stuff like that. Those I kind of see as kind of really essential to Gnosticism as I understand it.
Yeah, and Gnosis too, right?
Yes, and Gnosis.
Yeah, if special knowledge is not part of your system, then I would think that would exclude you from Gnosticism. I think that if there's one thing that has to be Gnostic, it's like, the saving power of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's
that in a nutshell is the answer to your previous question, Dale.
No, that's I appreciate that. By the way, I noticed, John, you posted a link to this Rethinking Gnosticism, an argument for dismantling a dubious category. Do you know the basic idea behind that?
Yeah, what I said earlier, even when Daniel was in there, that there's basically so many differences between all the Gnosticisms that we know of that there's very difficult to latch onto a set of criteria to say this is Gnostic and this isn't. So he wants to replace the category Gnosticism with basically a bunch of smaller categories that just group smaller groups together, like Leon was suggesting.
Yeah, I think we're almost done with this chapter of the book. I think we should discuss the conclusion, section 107, 108, pretty quick.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to read one quick summary paragraph, really small, at the bottom of page 108. All in all, we may state that Marcion, like everybody else, is a man of his time, and since his time was the age of Christian Gnosticism, he can by no means be seen as completely unrelated to the phenomenon as such. Still, his system of thought remains unique, and our knowledge of pre-Marcionite Gnosticism remains fragmentary, so that any immediate Gnostic influence on him and his theology is no longer traceable.
How about vice versa, though? I mean, how much influence do we think he had on Gnosticism?
Yeah, I think Moll would probably agree. Yeah, you could say the same thing about the vice versa case. I'm guessing. I mean, if you can't prove it one way, you can't establish it the other either.
I also highlighted something he said on page 107 before that. Moreover, in our first chapter, we have seen that Gnostics such as Ptolemy are in fact already reacting to Marcion's doctrine.
Yeah, that was a good point too.
I also was curious about on page 107 where he says there is hardly any real evidence for an elaborate dualistic Gnostic system before the time of Marcion.
I don't know that that's true. I think that I see hints of a proto-Gnosticism in Philo.
Yeah, I think that statement kind of clicked with me. I highlighted it because I wanted to think about it some more.
Yeah.
I am tempted to think, though, that a lot of the later Gnostics, their ideas developed as a dissatisfaction with Marcion's theories and wanting to create something, that would work better in their minds. I do think they were aware of Marcion and just didn't really like all of it.
Yeah, well, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have made it into 3 parts instead of 2, which he really demonstrated that that's actually what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we can trust what's being said later on about the groups, they do also seem to be in some way related to what his views, initial views.
I mean, we have to grant all that, but yeah.
Because you would expect them to be reacting to any and everything, including orthodoxy, but it seems specifically to be a reaction to Marcion's initial dualism.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about Ptolemy, right?
Or any of the so-called Marcionite systems that are discussed.
Okay, yeah.
Any of the systems that went from 2 to 3 prongs.
Yeah. There was one other thing. We're kind of going back a little bit, but I thought it was interesting. Oh gosh, what was it? Oh, this interesting document that he discusses. This is back in the sources. Adamantius Dialogue speaks of 2 Marcionites, Megathius, however you say that, and Marcus, who alternately believe in the just God, good God, or evil God, tripartite, whatever system. So that's Megathius' believe that, and then Marcus, the good God, evil God distinctions. This is way, way out there, but has anyone argued? Huh?
What page were you on?
I don't remember. It was under the sources section where he's talking about the sources as far as.
So earlier chapter. Okay.
Adamantius Dialogue. Yeah, I just wanted to throw this out there. But do you guys know if there's any scholars arguing? I probably should have done this off live because it's really going way back there. But has anyone argued anything about Mark's gospel and any type of relationship to Marcionism, whether it's anti or for or?
Yes. This is a really good question for Dr. Price because he's actually touched on this before, specifically, I remember. And he does Marcionite influences on Mark and in Matthew as well, I think.
Okay, well, I'll just probably say that for another time then. But that's good to know. Thank you. So, what do you guys think of this whole section as a whole, and where we are so far up to?
I like how systematic Moll is being in trying to establish the evidence for what Marcion believed, and trying not to take things for granted.
I have a question though. Can anybody give me a good definition of what the word trotz means? Trotz.
I just used his basic description of it after he used it. It was kind of like reacting in spite, almost.
Well, that's kind of like the literal definition. Just didn't seem to be. I couldn't apply it because of grammatical issues.
Yeah, he even said there's really not. It's like Schadenfreude. There's no real direct English translation that really captures the whole sense of the word.
Mm.
So yeah, I don't know.
It's like having cojones or something.
That's pretty straightforward, though.
I mean, if you can say it in English, there's an English translation.
Grow up here, dude.
So are we ready to wrap up the live?
Yeah, I think so. Did anyone else have any general thoughts on the reading so far?
I got a feeling that I'm going to have a hard time with Chapter 4, but Chapter 3 was pretty cool. I think he argued it pretty well.
Well,
Yeah,
we'll
I
be
mean,
good on chapter 4 because I think we're all in agreement that Moll has that backwards. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like Moll a lot so far. I agree with Wayne. He's systematic. I had some issues with I thought some leaps he made using the sources, especially on some of the biographical stuff about Marcion. But
Yeah, chapter 2 left me with a slightly salty taste in my mouth.
yeah, I thought he made some leaps that weren't
He made
fully warranted.
too many assumptions.
But you know, I kind of, at the same time, I kind of like sympathize with that because, you know, the sources for Marcion aren't the greatest. So yeah, I mean, if you want to know anything about Marcion, at some point you're going to have to make some kind of assumptions. Or, I mean, you could just say nothing's reliable, so we can't know anything.
But is that really true, though? Is that really true? I mean, isn't it okay to also say we just don't know?
Well, let me be more careful about that. Ultimately, yeah, I don't think we can know in the same way like we can know, like, you know, what kind of car is sitting in my driveway right now. But if you want to reconstruct something about this guy from the past, from 2,000 years ago, you're using sources that are mainly from his enemies. I mean, yeah, you have to always have that caveat that
you can do the best you can, but you know how much latitude you have is kind of arbitrary, I think. But
yeah, exactly.
I think that there is a certain point at which you have to just say we just don't know. And I think chapter 2 he crossed that line a little bit too much for me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, too, like, Chapter 3 I felt like was, like you said, it was an improvement. I think he didn't make as many of those leaps and assumptions, yeah.
And so, while I'm on the topic, too, he seems to have lightened up on what I called the last time. I called it, what do you call it, hedging. The hedging language that he would
right.
use. He cooled it, he chilled out on that in this chapter.
Yeah, there may be parts where Moll is making conclusions where he should be more agnostic and say we don't know. One thing I'm only seeing one instance of where I think an alternative theory is more likely than what Moll presents is just on regarding what Moll, you know, whether Marcion was an editor of the text he had or not.
Right.
I think on his other points, I do not know of anything where any alternate theory that is more likely than what Moll is giving.
Doesn't Moll say early on that of all the heretics that we have the most information about Marcion?
I think he says that. I think we do, too, right? Of all the early heretics.
Yeah, well, it's kind of sad if that's the case, and we're still left with a lot of ambiguities.
Yeah.
Leon, do you agree in your mind? I mean, is there anything we've discussed so far, not talking about, you know, whether Marcion edited his texts, where you think there's an alternative theory that's more likely than what Moll presents?
Yeah, regarding the birth and stuff like that, I think that there are. I've read alternative. I think Tyson did it better. I think that even Joseph Hoffman kind of did it better.
Can you summarize that in 1 or 2 minutes, then, what the difference is?
Oh, wow. Well, no, I don't think so, because I'd have to review it, really. It's been a while.
Okay.
I thought the dating of the birth was not very strong. I mean, I think his dating of 100 to 110 is plausible. There's nothing wrong with it, but I don't think.
It's plausible, but what I had a problem with was when he made generalities like old people wouldn't do that, or maybe he just looked older than he really was. When he said things like that, I was just like, "Oh, you did not."
He's not trying to prove it from that. I think he's just trying to come up with, you know, what premise here, what idea here is the most likely scenario.
Right. He's trying to gather in all the factors that he feels are relevant, at least, to.
No, I get it.
His state plausible. Yeah.
I just thought.
Of course, the more assumptions you put into a theory, the more intrinsically unlikely the theory becomes.
Right.
Right. But I thought actually when he was summarizing Harnack's dating of what was
Yes.
it? I thought that was a better case personally. I don't remember all the details now, but I remember at the time I was reading it, I'm like, well, I don't know. I think I agree with Harnack on that particular thing.
And John just reminded me that one of the problems that I had last week, and I still feel this way about Chapter 2, is he seems to have like an armchair psychoanalyst feel to him. And I'm always wary of historical analysis where people are saying, well, Paul must have had some kind of a paranoid schizophrenic streak in him. I just don't buy the shit like that. Sorry about my language.
Yeah.
So are we
was
ready
interesting.
Are we ready to say goodbye to the live audience and go off yet?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, next week we're gonna do. Ooh, gosh, I'll have to look at the schedule now. I should have known it ahead of time. Does anyone know off the top of your head? Is it just 4 or 4 and 5?
I don't have it in front of me.
I think
Just 4. Yeah, just 4.
Okay, right on.
That's February 1st, this coming Sunday. And yeah, we're on Facebook. Check us out, Society of Biblical Scholarship. We're on Google Plus, or at least our events are posted on there by Ruben. And yeah, it'll be 6 p.m. again, February 1st, discussion section 4. That's
Check out our YouTube channel.
Yeah, and all these videos are on YouTube. So
Thanks,
anyway,
everyone.
good night, everyone.